Imagine standing on a blood-soaked battlefield, the clash of metal, the screams of comrades and enemies alike. The stench of iron fills your nostrils as blood stains the ground beneath your feet. You fought with everything you had, but when the battle ends, the true war begins. Not for the ones who died, their stories ended with their last breath, but for those who survived, broken in body and shattered in mind. What happens to them? They are the ones who lived, but at what cost? This isn't a story of glory. This is the story of the forgotten warriors, those who fought for Rome, but were left to fade into the shadows. Their pain didn't end with the battle. It only began. Rome, the heart of a vast empire, built on the blood and sweat of its soldiers. From the moment the Roman legions first marched across Europe, their power was felt from the cold northern forests of Germany to the sun-drenched sands of Africa. The Roman soldier was revered as the pinnacle of martial prowess, disciplined, unwavering, and deadly. But behind every conquest, behind every victory that carved Rome's empire into the map of history, there lies a hidden truth, the cost of war. And that cost was paid by the men who fought for Rome, the soldiers who bled, who died, and those who returned broken, their bodies shattered and their minds fractured. These soldiers were the backbone of the Roman military, the very lifeblood that kept the empire expanding. Yet, when the dust settled, when the war was over and the battle cries faded, what happened to them? What became of those who survived? Not the ones celebrated for their victories, but the ones who returned home with their wounds, both visible and invisible. The men who fought not for glory, but for survival. In ancient Rome, honor was everything. Glory belonged to the victorious. But for the soldiers who came back maimed, disfigured, and broken, there was no parade, no recognition. Instead, there was only silence, rejection, and a life spent in the shadow of the very empire they had fought to protect. Roman warfare was far from the romanticized image of a noble knight in shining armor. It was brutal, savage, and intimate. On the battlefield, there was no room for distance. The fighting was up close and personal. A Roman soldier's primary weapon, the gladius, was short, sharp, and deadly, designed for stabbing in tight combat. The Roman soldiers fought not as individual heroes, but as part of a greater whole, a machine of destruction meant to crush everything in its path. The battlefields were carnage. Spears pierced through flesh, arrows sliced the air like death's messengers, and the clang of shields and swords filled the air with a deafening rhythm. The clash of steel against steel, the agonizing cries of men as they were struck down. These were the sounds of Roman conquest. But the true brutality of Roman warfare was not in its victory, but in its aftermath. When the battle was over, it was not just the soldiers who died in glory. It was those who lived, their bodies broken, torn, and ravaged. Roman weapons were designed to kill, but even more so to maim. Spears, with their sharp iron tips, often left victims with deep, gaping wounds that would not heal. Arrows, too, were designed to tear through flesh and bone, but often left behind the worst kind of injuries. Infections that would slowly eat away at the body, turning a once proud warrior into a shell of his former self. But it wasn't just the Romans who had deadly weapons. The enemies of Rome, the barbarians, the Celts, the Germanic tribes, wielded weapons that were just as brutal. Axes that could sever limbs with one swing, maces that crushed skulls with an unstoppable force, and long swords that left open, ragged wounds. These weapons didn't just kill, They destroyed the body in ways that could never be repaired. A Roman soldier's life was often measured by the number of battles they fought and survived. But the true cost of battle wasn't always counted in dead bodies. The injuries soldiers sustained often didn't kill them immediately. Instead, they left them to suffer for days, sometimes weeks, in excruciating pain, their bodies rotting from within. And for many soldiers, death would come not from the blade of an enemy, but from the infections that set in after their wounds were inflicted. The lack of proper medical knowledge during these times meant that soldiers were often left with untreated wounds, lying in pools of their own blood, with nothing to stop the rot from setting in. Gangrene was a constant threat. Once it took hold, there was no stopping it. The infected limbs would turn black, the skin would slough off, and the soldier would be left to die in agonizing pain. This was the true horror of war, the slow, lingering death that claimed as many lives as the battle itself. But even if a soldier survived the initial injury, the real struggle began when they were pulled from the battlefield. The journey to medical care was just as brutal. Soldiers who were lucky enough to be pulled from the field often faced a grueling trek back to camp, carried on crude stretchers made from spears and cloaks, or thrown onto carts with no suspension to ease the bumps of the road. Every jolt of the cart sent waves of agony through their broken bodies, every bump a reminder of how close they were to death. While the physical wounds of war were gruesome, they were often easier to see. The missing limbs, the disfigured faces, the deep scars that covered the bodies of those who returned. These were the obvious reminders of the horrors soldiers had endured. But there were wounds far deeper, wounds that couldn't be seen, that no surgeon could treat. We call it post-traumatic stress disorder today, but in ancient Rome, there was no name for it, no understanding of the lasting damage that war could do to the mind. Instead, it was simply known as weakness. To show any sign of emotional pain was to risk being branded as less than a man, less than a soldier. In a society that worshipped strength, endurance, and stoicism, those who couldn't bear the weight of their trauma were ignored, abandoned, and left to suffer in silence. Soldiers who returned from battle with shattered minds often faced a life worse than death. They didn't just lose their ability to fight, they lost their very sense of self. They couldn't sleep, haunted by nightmares of the horrors they had seen. The sounds of battle echoed in their minds, the cries of their comrades still ringing in their ears. Some soldiers would freeze at the sound of a loud noise, the pounding of hooves, or the clang of metal, all reminders of the battlefields they had left behind. But what was worse than the physical scars was the emotional toll. Anger, rage, fear, and deep sadness consumed them. They would lash out at those around them, unable to control the flood of emotions that overwhelmed them. Others became reclusive, hiding away from the world, unable to reconnect with their families or communities. They could no longer be the men they were before the war. They were broken, and the world had no place for them. The Roman Empire did not have the compassion nor the understanding to deal with this unseen affliction. To the Romans, a soldier who could not return to normal life was a failure, a man who had lost his virtue. They were taught that true strength meant enduring pain without complaint, to carry on without letting it show. The idea of a soldier being mentally scarred was anathema to the Roman ideal of invincibility. So those who couldn't cope with the psychological damage of war were abandoned. We know now that the mental toll of war is just as devastating as the physical. But back then, soldiers who returned mentally broken were cast aside as weaklings. No sympathy, no understanding, just the cold gaze of a society that saw emotional pain as something to be ashamed of. The Roman soldier, after all, was expected to be a paragon of endurance, both in body and in mind. When a Roman soldier was severely wounded, there was little hope for survival. The medical system of Rome, while advanced in some areas, was still primitive by today's standards. The Medici, the military doctors of the Roman Empire, were tasked with keeping soldiers alive long enough to fight again, but they were not trained to heal in the way modern medicine does. Their primary job was not saving lives, it was prolonging them. The treatment was harsh. A soldier who suffered a severe injury was often treated in one of the legion's field hospitals, or valetudinaria, which were little more than makeshift medical camps filled with the stench of blood, sweat, and unsterilized instruments. These hospitals were not designed to cure, but to manage the immediate effects of injury. There was no understanding of infection, no antibiotics to fight off disease. The concept of germs was non-existent. The tools available were crude, iron hooks, bronze saws, and forceps, but these were the best that Roman medicine had to offer. When a soldier was injured, especially with a wound that couldn't be healed, the Medici were faced with two choices: amputate or let the soldier die. Amputation was often the only solution when a limb was destroyed. The soldiers were not given anesthetics. Wine was the closest thing to pain relief. The Medici would cauterize the wound, sealing it with a hot iron to stop the bleeding, all while the screams of the injured man echoed through the camp. The pain was unimaginable, but the alternative was death from blood loss or infection. In some cases, the wound didn't kill immediately, but it still led to death in the following days. Infection, gangrene, or fever could set in. A soldier's fate was often sealed not by the injury itself, but by the lack of proper treatment. The conditions in Roman military camps were unsanitary. Wounds were left exposed to the elements, to dirt, to sweat, to blood. These were the perfect breeding grounds for bacteria. Without the understanding of hygiene, infections were a constant threat. The soldiers' bodies, already broken by the enemy's weapons, were now at war with their own infections. In the worst cases, soldiers didn't die from the initial injury, but from the slow agony of gangrene. The infection would spread, consuming the body from within. Flesh turned black, the limbs rotted, and the pain was excruciating. For many soldiers, this was the final battle, not against an enemy, but against their own decaying bodies. There were no options left but to amputate, and even then, survival wasn't guaranteed. Many died on the operating table, victims of both their wounds and the primitive medical care they received. But it wasn't just about the soldiers who survived the initial battle wounds. Even those who made it back to camp, who managed to live through their injuries, faced a grueling recovery process. The medical facilities were overcrowded, resources were scarce, and even the best surgeons couldn't save every life. Soldiers who survived wounds that would have been fatal in other times often faced a slow death from infections. For them, survival wasn't the end of the battle. It was merely the beginning of a long, painful journey. Roman military medicine was based on what worked, but it wasn't concerned with healing. It was concerned with survival. The Medici didn't save lives in the modern sense. They just delayed death. But even then, many soldiers didn't make it. The war didn't end when the battle did. The real battle for many Roman soldiers began when they were pulled from the battlefield and placed into the hands of the Medici. Some survived, but at a cost, and for others, The cost was too high. Even if a Roman soldier survived the immediate aftermath of battle, even if he endured the brutal treatments of the Medici, the real struggle began once he left the battlefield. For many, returning home wasn't a triumphant return to the arms of loved ones. Instead, it was a slow, painful slide into neglect and rejection. Roman society honored its victorious warriors, celebrated their strength, and marked their glory with monumental arches and statues. But for the soldiers who came back maimed and broken, there was no parade, no triumph, only silence. Those who survived the physical wounds, but whose bodies had been forever scarred, faced a life of hardship. If a soldier completed his service, he might receive an honorable discharge, land, a pension, and respect. But that was for those who had served with full health, not for those who returned disfigured or disabled. For the vast majority of wounded soldiers, there was no such honor. They were sent home without compensation, without support, and without a place in society. Many soldiers who returned home missing limbs, or with their faces disfigured, found themselves outcasts. The empire that had once celebrated their strength and bravery now turned its back on them. In a society obsessed with appearance, with strength, and with endurance, a disfigured soldier was a shameful reminder of the true cost of war. These men who had fought for Rome were now considered burdens to society. Without the ability to fight or work, many of these soldiers were left to survive however they could. Some turned to begging, wandering the streets of Rome or provincial towns, living off whatever alms they could collect. Others, desperate for any means of survival, took on menial jobs, such as working in small shops or as market vendors. Their days were spent in poverty, scraping by just to stay alive. But some soldiers found a different path. They became mercenaries, selling their services to anyone willing to pay. The blood they had spilled for Rome was now used to earn a meager living elsewhere. Others, unable to bear the thought of fading into obscurity, joined gladiator schools. The arena offered them fame, but at a cost, a brutal life in exchange for a fleeting moment of glory. Many gladiators had been soldiers before, men who, like their fellow veterans, had been forgotten by Rome, but found a place to fight once again, this time for the amusement of the masses. However, even the gladiatorial life came with a price. Death in the arena was often quicker than the slow, torturous death of living in poverty or obscurity. The blood-spattered sands of the Colosseum offered a more dignified end for some than the humiliation of begging in the streets or wandering in isolation. Yet, there were others who, despite their injuries, found work within the military itself. Some became scribes, filling out paperwork, managing supplies, or organizing records in the camps. Others found less glamorous roles, guarding supply depots or watchtowers. These roles allowed them to remain within the military structure, where they could still find purpose, even if they could no longer fight. But these opportunities weren't always available. In times of political instability, during economic collapse, or when the empire was embroiled in war, the chances for these men to find stable work within the military diminished. Everything depended on the local commanders and the resources available. For many, the lack of opportunities left them with no choice but to rely on the kindness of family or the charity of strangers. The Roman Empire was built on the backs of soldiers, but for all their sacrifices, the empire rarely returned the favor. While Rome glorified its conquests, its generals, and its emperors, the men who bled for the empire, the ones who survived battle, scarred in body and mind, were left to suffer without recognition. Despite the glory and wealth that Rome's victories brought, the cost of war was paid by the soldiers who returned home broken. The promise of rewards for their service, land, a pension, or an honorable discharge, was often a hollow one. For many, this promise was never fulfilled. Those who survived without fully completing their service found themselves dismissed without so much as a thank you. And for those who came back disfigured or maimed, there was no recognition at all. The Roman military was pragmatic, calculating the value of a soldier based on his ability to fight. Once a soldier could no longer carry a sword, his worth to the empire was diminished. And for those who didn't receive the missio honesta, the honorable discharge with benefits, there was only the missio caesaria, a medical discharge. This discharge didn't come with land, pensions, or the respect they once earned on the battlefield. It came with the bitter sting of being sent home, without compensation, without support, and without a place in society. In times of peace, this neglect could be felt the most. The empire, which had been quick to claim the victories of its legions, was slow to care for the men who had made those victories possible. The promise of a stable life after service was often empty, and these veterans were left to navigate a world that had no place for them. Those who couldn't find work within the military, or as mercenaries turned to begging or worse, resorting to violent means to survive. Many joined gladiator schools, hoping for some small measure of respect and a chance at the fleeting fame that the arena could offer. But even that was a brutal existence. There was a military fund, the Aurarium Military, created to support veterans. But as with so many other promises, this too was often neglected. When the empire was in times of crisis or political turmoil, the fund was diverted for luxuries at the imperial court, rather than for the men who had fought to protect it. Many veterans died waiting for pensions that never came. Others were forgotten entirely. In the end, Rome failed to repay the debt owed to the very soldiers who had fought for its glory. The empire, which had once celebrated the strength of its legions, abandoned them when they were no longer useful. While monuments and arches stood as reminders of the empire's triumphs, the men who made those triumphs possible were left to fade into obscurity. Their sacrifices, their pain, and their very lives erased from history. But not every soldier was entirely forgotten. Some found ways to survive, even in the face of such overwhelming neglect. They adapted, they scraped by, and they carved out small spaces for themselves in a world that had no place for them. The very nature of Roman society, so focused on strength, so obsessed with glory, had no room for the weak, the broken, the disfigured. And yet, those soldiers who endured, despite everything, are the true testament to the cost of war. The story of these soldiers is not one of glory. It is not one of heroic deeds celebrated in marble statues or written in golden letters across history. It is a story of survival, of pain, of abandonment, and of sacrifice that went unrecognized. The warriors who fought for Rome, who spilled their blood on the battlefields, were forgotten by the very empire they helped to build. Rome was an empire that conquered vast territories, built monumental cities, and created a legacy that still resonates today. But behind every victory, behind every triumph, there were the men who made it possible. The soldiers who bled for their empire, who fought not for wealth or glory, but for survival, only to be cast aside when they were no longer of use. The legacy of these men is not etched in the stones of triumphal arches or immortalized in grand marble statues. Their story has been lost to time, overshadowed by the grandeur of Rome's greatest achievements. But their sacrifice, their pain, and their suffering should never be forgotten. They fought for Rome, and in return, they were discarded, their contributions overlooked, their lives relegated to the shadows. The real cost of war is not measured in victories or conquests, but in the lives of the soldiers who fought and survived, only to be abandoned when the fighting ended. These men did not return home to celebrations or honors. They returned to rejection, to neglect, and to a life of poverty. They were the true victims of war, not the ones who died in battle, but the ones who lived and suffered in silence. Rome may have forgotten them, but we should not. These forgotten soldiers were the ones who carried the weight of Rome's glory on their broken shoulders. And though their names may never be etched in history, their stories deserve to be remembered. Their suffering was real, and it is time we honored them for the sacrifices they made. If this story moved you, if you believe these soldiers deserve to be remembered, share this video and spread their story. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more untold stories from history, the ones that the world has forgotten. And as always, may Mars guide you in battle.